I stand before you.
Not now!
Can you hear me?
Fire! Load!
A burning tank destroyer, ready to explode at any second. A 19-year-old lieutenant standing alone on top of it, in plain view of 6 German tanks and 250 infantrymen advancing across an open snowfield. A 50 caliber machine gun in his hands, and no one else left on that position to help him fire it. For the next hour, that lieutenant would kill or wound as many as 50 enemy soldiers, take a bullet in the leg, and refuse to move, because the alternative was watching his entire company get overrun. We'll show you exactly how a 19-year-old sharecropper's son from Texas ended up alone on that burning wreck in a moment. First, you need to understand why an entire German offensive was riding on whether he'd get off it alive. His name was Audie Murphy. By the time the war ended, he would become the most decorated American combat soldier in the history of the United States Army. This is the story of the hour that made him a legend, near a French village most Americans have never heard of, in a battle most Americans have never been taught. The threat by January of 1945, the German army had already lost the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, and Adolf Hitler's last major offensive on the Western Front, Operation Nordwind, was grinding toward its final, desperate phase. Launched on New Year's Eve, Nordwind had been conceived as a follow-on strike meant to exploit whatever damage the Ardennes offensive had inflicted on Allied reserves, hitting American and French forces further south along the front in Alsace. It failed to achieve anything close to its original ambitions, but the fighting it triggered across the region did not simply stop when the main offensive stalled. It fed directly into a much longer, grinding struggle to eliminate the last significant German-held territory west of the Rhine River. But there remained one place along the entire front where German forces still held ground west of the Rhine, a heavily fortified salient around the city of Colmar in eastern France, defended by roughly 30,000 German troops dug into positions built to hold through the winter. Allied commanders called it the Colmar Pocket, and it represented more than stubborn German pride. If that pocket broke out rather than being crushed, it could roll into the flank of the overextended American 7th Army, and from there threaten the wider Allied advance into Germany itself. Clearing it was not optional. It was the last major German foothold on French soil, and it had to fall. On January 23, 1945, the American 3rd Infantry Division's 30th Infantry Regiment pushed into the Bois de Riedwihr, a forest near the small village of Holtzwihr, and ran directly into a determined German counterattack of tanks, tank destroyers, and infantry. Fighting on open, frozen ground where the earth was too hard to dig into, the regiment was mauled and forced to withdraw. 3 days later, on January 26th, it would be Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment's turn to hold that same exposed ground, and the man commanding that company, only recently promoted, was a 19-year-old second lieutenant named Audie Murphy, a soldier whose company had already been so badly depleted by weeks of continuous combat that its collapse under a serious attack was not a remote possibility. It was the most likely outcome. Murphy himself was, by January of 1945, already a combat veteran in every meaningful sense despite his youth. He had landed in Sicily in 1943, fought through the invasion of southern France, and had been repeatedly wounded and repeatedly returned to the front, accumulating a record of decorations that already marked him as an exceptional soldier well before the events at Holtzwihr. He rejoined his platoon in the Colmar sector on January 14th after recovering from a previous wound, and within days found himself thrust into command of an entire company at an age when most young men his age back home were still finishing high school. The men under him were, like Murphy himself, exhausted from weeks of grinding winter combat in terrain that offered little shelter and even less rest, facing an enemy that had chosen to make its final stand on French soil at exactly this stretch of frozen ground. The secret development: there was no secret weapon waiting for Murphy's company at Holtzwihr. What there was, instead, was a desperately thin defensive line, a promised reinforcement that never arrived in time, and a battlefield that gave the incoming German attack every possible advantage. Murphy had spent the morning improvising the strongest position he could manage with what little he had. He anchored his right flank with a single M10 tank destroyer from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion and a handful of light vehicles from the division's reconnaissance troop, loosely tied his left flank to Company A, and pushed a second tank destroyer roughly 40 yards ahead of his main line, positioned to cover the one narrow dirt road any German armor would have to use to reach his position. He set up his own command post in a shallow drainage ditch just 10 yards behind that forward vehicle, connected to battalion headquarters a mile to the rear by a single field telephone. When he called back for last-minute instructions that morning, the answer he received was not the one he needed. The reinforcements he had been promised, an entire 2nd Battalion, had not yet arrived and would not reach him in time. His orders were simple and offered no comfort at all. Hold your position. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, following a German artillery barrage, Murphy watched the counterattack take shape from his forward position. 6 tanks and roughly 250 German infantrymen, dressed in white winter camouflage that made them almost invisible against the snow-covered fields until they were dangerously close. He had just enough warning to reach his field telephone and call in artillery fire from the battalion's guns before the fighting began in earnest. What followed was not a battle his depleted company was equipped to win in a conventional sense. Both American tank destroyers were quickly knocked out of action, one after another, their crews forced to abandon them and fall back into the tree line. Murphy, watching his position collapse and the German tanks close to within striking distance, gave the order that any responsible commander in his position would have given. He told his remaining men to withdraw into the woods behind them to prepared secondary positions where they might still have a chance to survive what was coming. Murphy himself started to follow them. He had already expended every round of ammunition in his own carbine, firing at the advancing Germans until there was simply nothing left to fire. By any reasonable measure, his job at that position was finished. He had held as long as a man with an empty weapon reasonably could, ordered his company to safety, and had every justification in the world to fall back alongside them into the tree line where the rest of Company B was already regrouping. And then he saw the burning tank destroyer sitting abandoned nearby, its .50 caliber machine gun still mounted, and as far as he could tell, still functional. It is worth pausing on the decision itself, because it was genuinely a decision made consciously, not a reflexive act performed without thought. Murphy had already done everything a company commander in his position could reasonably be expected to do. He had directed artillery fire, held his ground as long as the position was tenable, and ordered a withdrawal at the moment it became the only responsible choice available. Nobody, least of all his own superiors, would have questioned him for continuing that withdrawal into the tree line alongside his men. Instead, watching 6 tanks and roughly 250 infantrymen close in on a wooded position his exhausted, demoralized company had almost no realistic chance of holding if the German assault reached it at full strength, Murphy made a different calculation entirely: that one more weapon, even a single machine gun on an exposed and burning wreck, might be the difference between his company surviving the day and being overrun before reinforcements could ever arrive. Technical supremacy: there is no chapter in this story about superior American firepower, because for the better part of an hour, Murphy's entire arsenal against 6 tanks and roughly 250 infantrymen consisted of a single machine gun mounted on a vehicle that could explode at any moment. He climbed onto the wreck alone, in full view of the advancing Germans, exposed to fire from 3 directions at once, and began firing. The M10 tank destroyer he mounted was, itself, an imperfect vehicle for exactly this kind of improvised last-stand and open-top turret design, built for speed and firepower against enemy armor rather than crew protection, which meant Murphy had no overhead cover of any kind while he fought. Nothing between himself and German fire except smoke, distance, and luck. The smoke pouring from the burning tank destroyer, thick and constant, worked in his favor in a way he had not fully anticipated. Murphy later described the strange, almost surreal cover it provided, with the sound of gunfire and exploding shells filling the air from every direction. The Germans advancing on his position apparently could not immediately isolate where the machine gun fire tearing into their ranks was actually coming from. That confusion bought him time he would not otherwise have had. At one point, a squad of German soldiers crept up along a drainage ditch directly in front of his position, close enough that Murphy could see them stop and confer with each other before he opened fire and cut them down where they stood. For a full hour, German forces threw everything they had at the burning wreck and the lone American on top of it, and none of it worked. Murphy's directed artillery fire, called in earlier and still landing on the advancing infantry even as he fought from the tank destroyer, killed large numbers of German soldiers before they ever reached his position at all. His machine gun fire, sustained under direct enemy attack from 3 sides simultaneously, killed or wounded an estimated 50 German soldiers over the course of that hour. He was wounded in the leg during the fighting and kept firing anyway, stopping only when he finally ran out of ammunition entirely. Only then did he climb down from the wreck and make his way back to his own lines, disregarding his wound, to rejoin what remained of his company. Moments after he left it, the tank destroyer's ammunition finally detonated, throwing its turret high into the air, a fate Murphy had spent the previous hour standing directly on top of, waiting to happen at any second, and refusing to let it change what he was doing. What makes this stand so remarkable from a purely tactical standpoint is the sheer geometry of Murphy's exposure. He was not fighting from cover. He was not fighting from a foxhole or behind a wall. He was standing upright on top of an elevated, burning vehicle, visible from virtually every angle the advancing Germans could approach from, with German infantry closing in from 3 separate directions simultaneously, and German tank crews fully capable of finishing off the wreck with a single well-aimed round at almost any moment during that hour. Later, reflecting on the experience in his own account, Murphy described a strange, almost detached clarity to those minutes, noting with dark humor that the flames from the burning tank destroyer, for the first time in 3 days of bitter winter cold, had finally kept his feet warm. That kind of observation, offered without any dramatization, says something about the psychological reality of sustained combat that a citation full of casualty figures never quite captures. He was not thinking about heroism while it was happening. He was thinking about his line of fire, his ammunition count, and the men in the tree line behind him whose survival depended entirely on him staying exactly where he was. The global impact. Murphy's stand did not end the fighting at Holtzwihr, and it was never meant to. What it did was buy Company B enough time and inflict enough damage on the attacking German force that the assault lost its momentum entirely. Rather than retreating or simply enduring what remained of the attack, Murphy, still wounded, refused evacuation and instead organized and led his own men in an immediate counterattack, retaking the exact ground his company had been forced to abandon less than an hour earlier. Company B held that position through the rest of the day and into the night. The following morning, reinforced by the 3rd Battalion of the 30th Infantry Regiment, American forces captured Holtzwihr itself. Within 2 more days, German forces east of the Ill River and north of the Colmar Canal had largely withdrawn, their offensive broken. The strategic stakes behind that single afternoon were larger than one company's survival. Military historians studying the Colmar Pocket have pointed out exactly what a German breakthrough at that moment could have meant: an opportunity to strike the overextended flank of the American 7th Army, potentially threatening the advancing Third Army as well, with consequences that could have reached as far as retaking the critical port of Antwerp and reversing months of Allied progress in a single, catastrophic reversal. Murphy's company, undermanned, exhausted, and facing an attack it had every reasonable expectation of losing, held the ground that made that scenario impossible. Historians examining the engagement afterward concluded plainly that had Murphy not made his stand on that burning tank destroyer, his badly depleted, demoralized company would very likely have been overrun and destroyed entirely, opening exactly the kind of gap in the American line that German commanders were counting on finding. The Colmar Pocket campaign as a whole represented something larger than a single contested stretch of eastern France. It was the last significant body of German territory west of the Rhine, and clearing it carried real symbolic weight beyond its tactical importance. Proof, delivered in the brutal language of frozen fields and burning vehicles, that the German army's ability to hold ground on French soil had finally, completely, run out. The 3rd Infantry Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its performance during the campaign, and Murphy's own actions at Holtzwihr became, almost immediately, one of the defining individual episodes soldiers and officers throughout the division referenced when describing exactly what had made the difference in those final, grinding days of the fight for Colmar. For the men of Company B who watched their 19-year-old commander climb onto that burning wreck, the moment carried a weight that no citation could fully translate. These were soldiers who had already spent weeks fighting alongside Murphy through some of the harshest winter conditions of the entire European campaign. Men who understood, better than any historian writing decades later ever could, exactly how thin the line was between an orderly withdrawal and a total collapse. Private First Class Anthony Abramsky and other members of the company later provided sworn statements describing what they had witnessed that afternoon. Statements that would eventually become part of the official record supporting Murphy's Medal of Honor recommendation. First-hand accounts, not from historians